What a delight to be here, and I'm really looking forward to my conversation, of course, with Dr. Bogdan in a few minutes. And if the energy panel thought it was hard going after lunch, I recognize our panel is kind of a heavy policy, sort of wonky topic, and I think we're to the end of the day's official program. So this has to go really good to try to keep your interest and energy, so I will try to do that. As mentioned, I have spent my career really in the international field, and I have segued in between international development, both working and living and running programs abroad, and then in policy, working both in the Bush administration and most recently in the Trump administration. And I currently work in a bipartisan national membership coalition called the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. And we are active all across the country. We have state advisory committees that are really the strength of our organization. We have one here in Colorado, all across the heartland in the country. And really it's important, right? Because what we seek to do is advocate for why America's global leadership is important. And I think, as anyone who has followed this topic, it's really hard not to follow this topic, right? There seems to be ebbs and flows, right? Anyone like myself, I love statistics. I'm very much into, evidential learning and, having quantitative data to back up your positions, right? We have really followed the polls, and especially now, it's an election year, right? And really looking where voter attitudes are on the posture of America's global leadership. And even in my own career, in 25 years being in Washington, D.C., right, I've seen sort of the highs and lows of sort of when not only, I'm obviously Republican, I'm a lifelong conservative, even in our own party, right? And it's so often really based on what we see happening globally around us and how voters and citizens understand how what happens globally actually has an impact on them here locally. And it's something that I've taken on the last couple years is really a passion, which is understanding that we have to get outside of the Beltway. If we want anyone in an issue advocacy, world to understand what it is that we think is important and why, we have to meet people where they're at. And so for myself, when I come and do speaking, I do most of it outside of Washington, D.C. And it's really important to me to go to Iowa, right? To go to Utah, to go to Kansas, and to sit down and really help make the issue relative to people in that state. I always say my parents still live on the small family farm in rural Iowa that I grew up on and still operate the farm. And I always say, if I can convince my parents that international engagement or a particular investment that I was overseeing in my last role at USAID, or a foreign policy, that the president was going to unveil, why it was important and mattered to them, and they believed it, then it was a really good investment in our policy, right? That's really important. And so I wanted to talk about a couple things. The first thing I will say is, as someone who is a lifelong Republican and conservative, I often get people, especially when I'm speaking in Washington, who will call me ahead of time and say, so we just want you to know about the crowd you're talking to. And I'm like, oh, okay, tell me about the crowd I'm talking to. And they're like, well, we understand you're Republican and you're a fiscal conservative. And I say, yes. And then they say, well, our audience is really interested in America's global engagement and alliances and the strength of our posture on the world stage and foreign assistance. And then I have to say, so am I. And that usually, is a moment of just kind of silence, and they're like, really? And I'm like, yes. And again, I think to the earlier panels, one of the last messages, right? Not one party owns this issue, right? But I'm really proud as a conservative of the history that our party has had when it comes to America's global engagement. And they would particularly say, right, we feel like we are the party because we have really promoted this doctrine of peace through strength, right? We really talked about that and championed it back in the 80s with President Reagan, and we still are really proud. Our latest, for those of you who were in Milwaukee, I hope many of you were, You know, our new, thank you, one person at least, thank you. I needed some clap, okay, I'll take what I can get. You know, our new platform enshrines this. It talks about the importance of peace through strength, right? Of America's global engagement. This is not something our party has lost, right? This remains important. So I wanted to just sort of go over really quickly two things. One, what I call sort of the conservative case for a strong America's global leadership. And then I kind of want to end, before George and I have our discussion with you all in the audience, kind of debunking what I consider 5 myths about, one, foreign engagement, and 2, particularly conservative foreign engagement. And so I want to just kind of set the stage, and most of you already know this, right? You don't have to be in foreign policy, international development to know, you know, simply put, the world is on fire, right? You turn on the television, you put on your radio, I don't care where you are in the country, right? The headlines are all the same, right? It seems like the world is under siege, right? Right now, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Europe is experiencing the largest geographical war since World War II. Hamas's attack on Israel on October 7th, killing over 1,200 people, was the deadliest day in Jewish history since the Holocaust, right? These are 2 examples we're really following. Beyond that, when you look across the world today, it is estimated that 14% of the world's population lives within 5 kilometers, which means they are directly exposed to violent conflict. And not only is this a huge humanitarian cost, right? It exacerbates poverty, right? We see health outcomes go down. We see migrants, you know, moving on, looking for better opportunities. We also know it has a global impact. They estimate today that the global impact of this conflict around the world is $19.1 trillion. That is 13% of our global GDP, right? Those are statistics you just can't not think about when you say, what does this have to do with us? We also know poverty is on the rise. We have about 830 people going to bed hungry every night. 2 billion people don't know where their next meal will come from, right? And unfortunately, conflict drives these issues of humanitarian need, and these issues of humanitarian need are driving conflict, right? In the world's poorest areas, where we see the most poverty, where we see hunger being prevalent, right? We also see the rise in violent extremism. We see conflict rising, right? These become really, they become breeding grounds for violent extremism and for terrorists to come in and try to work with the local populace. And so I would say that today, right, when we're at an election, when we look at the polls and Americans are rightfully saying, hey, when it comes to my life, I feel like the most important issues are domestic issues. You know, I'm here to say we can acknowledge that while also being able to say this global landscape I'm talking about has a lot to do with the domestic issues we're facing today. And by sort of not looking there, not engaging, not investing, it's not going to make our domestic problems any better. We really need to look at how we can address both. So when you look at sort of the reasons conservatives have really long fostered and championed a strong America's global engagement, I would say there's 3 primary buckets, right? The first would be values. And this is something that I'm very proud of as a conservative, right? We believe in America's exceptionalism, right? This is one of the things I loved most when I got to know Steamboat, and Jennifer introduced to her about a year ago, right? So many of the values Steamboat has is what I often think of as our values in foreign policy, right? It's understanding that there's a human right to freedom, to liberty, to dignity, to opportunity, right? We know that America is that shining city on the hill. And when you look back to the 1980s, when you look to President Reagan, and his leadership in that Cold War fight against communism, right? It really was about these values and these ideologies. We also promote, of course, a strong defense. Why? Because we know America's global leadership has everything to do with our own national security here at home. So I talked about all these issues going on around the world. We can get into this a little more detail. There is an interconnected threat to everything we see, from Putin's invasion of Ukraine, from his posture throughout the rest of Europe, to China watching America to see what our response is going to be because their eyes are on Taiwan. Let me give you a quick example of interconnected threats there. If you look at Taiwan right now, which as we all know is a democracy, a country we've long had a relationship with, 44% of the world's shipping containers go through the Taiwan Strait. China knows that a conflict with Taiwan is going to hugely disrupt the global shipping routes and the global economy. In fact, they estimate that that could cost at least about 13 billion, excuse me, I want to get the statistic right, because I can't say I believe in statistics and not give it to you, but that it would cost $10 trillion, right? That's a cost that's going to come back and hit us here at home, much like we have seen still the reverberating effects from the COVID-19 pandemic around the world and the shutdown of global supply chains, right? These things all come back and affect us here at home. We also recognize that with national security, right, we believe in a strong defense. We also recognize that defense is a last resort, right? We do not want to put our men and women, our servicemen and women in harm's way. We also recognize it costs a lot of money to have to respond to a conflict versus preventing it. And through strength, through peace through strength, through deterrence, through bold diplomacy, our conservative approach has been to negate and to head off conflicts before they become full-scale wars. The third is, and the area I like to talk about the most because I don't know that we often focus on this, is thinking about foreign policy as a matter of economic security. And this is an area where, especially when I am speaking out in the States, I like to talk about it from the viewpoint of a state economy, right? This is where if you are sitting in Iowa or you're sitting in Colorado and you're saying, I really don't know what Ukraine or Taiwan, et cetera, have to do with me, we look at our economy, right? So right now, when you look across the world, right, the United States is only 5% of the world's population. That means 95% of the world's population, obviously, right, easy math, lives outside our borders. We also know that we're currently the world's largest economy, and our economy stays strong and has become stronger because of our global trade. Today, 13% of our nearly $23 trillion domestic economy is based on trade, and that continues to grow. We also know that US exports right now are directly tied to American jobs. It actually supports 1 in 5 jobs across the United States. That again is growing. You see those numbers in some states, my state of Iowa, even higher because of the commodity trades, right? The agricultural trades, and how lucrative that is across the world. Simply put, we need partners to trade with us. We need to develop trading routes. We need to make sure that there is a modicum of security, there are open shipping routes, so that we can get these goods and services across, because at the end of the day, this has everything to do with our economy. So I want to talk now about sort of what I hear a lot. I also work with a lot of candidates. I do a lot of meetings with candidates for Congress. And we sort of talk about this, right? And one of the things that they'll share with me and then I hear when I go out to communities and I talk to voters about issues is what the next 5 points I'm going to talk about, which I call are sort of common myths, and that I spend a lot of time in advocacy talking about. And the first is kind of to our Republican Party and our approach, and I call this the binary debate. There seems to be this myth right now that in the Republican Party, you are either labeled an isolationist or you are a globalist. And both come with baggage, right? No one wants to be the isolationist, no one wants to be the globalist, but somehow we're sort of pointing a lot of fingers that you're either one or the other, right? You either want to completely disengage, right? You're a nationalist or a populist, another important term where you're like, no, we have to focus on us, ourselves, don't worry about anyone else. Or the globalist or the international engagement person will say, listen, there's, every decision we make, everything we do, it's not just about America. It's about, how can we also benefit the world, right? These two very distinct ideas. It's not a binary debate. I have truly in my career never met anyone who is a true globalist or a true isolationist, right? The truth is somewhere in the middle. And I think one of the things that working in the Trump administration I appreciated so much is really how we rephrased America's engagement. And you see some of this in the new platform. It was looking at engagement, it was not shying away from international engagement, but it was saying, we also have to step back and say, but what does this have to do with Americans? What's the return on the investment, right? Is there a correlation between how this will benefit a taxpayer in Michigan, versus funding we send to Ukraine? Like, why are we doing this, right? And I think that's so important. Part of it has to do with education. Policymakers, we have to do a better job of educating people and being communicative about what these issues really are and how decisions are being made. The second myth that I hear a lot, especially as someone who worked for 4 years in the Trump administration, is, well, I don't know how you could say you support America's global engagement because America first means America alone. To which I say, how much time do you have? Do you really want to get into this and hear the answer? Because America first is not America alone. It goes back to what I just said. America first was never about being isolationist. One of the really best national security strategies I have ever really worked under was the one that President Trump issued in 2017 at the beginning of his first term. Because what it sought to do was talk about, again, what I just said, America's global engagement through the lens of the American taxpayer. And it sought to say, it is important for us to engage. It is important for us to work with our allies, to have good diplomatic partners, to stand strong against our adversaries, because we recognize it has everything to do with our national security and our economy. And we will strive to make sure we're always telling the taxpayer what that correlation is. America first, while really prioritizing that sort of change, I would say, of focus, right? Starting here at home and then looking abroad and making the connection that way, really also was about bold diplomacy, right? It was, again, as I said, it was not isolationist. It also wasn't interventionist. What it was stepping back and saying, this is all about prevention. It's about deterrence of our adversaries, to foster more conflicts, to create wars that will, that could unintentionally bring us into it. And it's also recognizing that should that day ever come, unfortunately, our best advantage over our adversaries will be our strong allies. The third thing I like to talk about, and this is really where I get people, I'm going to talk about federal spending. Don't everyone leave the room en masse, because I am going to be a little provocative here and say it's not just about the defense budget, right? We believe in a strong defense. I believe in a strong defense, right? I think that's one of our core values. I'm also someone who likes to look at the numbers, and I like to do the data. And in the current organization I'm in right now, one of our strongest assets and groups is actually our National Security Advisory Council. This is a group of nearly 100 former 3- and 4-star generals, the highest levels of defense, right? Former secretaries of defense, et cetera, who say, we have so overlooked our soft power tools, our international affairs budget, which is our prevention engagement overseas, to the detriment that now, when the defense is called in, when we have to actually start drawing down on that defense budget, we pay $16 for every $1 we could have spent on just prevention, right? That's a huge 1 to 16, right? And so they're our biggest advocates there. So our conservative approach to this says, absolutely, we support a strong defense. But again, we're going to do everything we can to make sure, one, they have what they need, while making sure we don't have to engage the military in being a last resort to solving international issues, right? And so right now, if you would ask many Americans, what do we spend on national defense? They wouldn't particularly know. They shouldn't know, I wouldn't say that. But if I ask them, what do you think we spend on international assistance, which is the other bucket, right? So if you look at the national security funding, you have the defense, and then you have the IIB. And they'll say, it's probably 25% of our budget. And I think, do you think I would support us spending 25% of our budget on that? No, it's less than 1%. And for that less than 1% of the entire national federal budget, right, we are getting this economic return on our investments, and we are contributing to stabilization. That leads me to my next point. Foreign assistance, foreign aid is a handout. Why would conservatives support handouts? We don't. What we support is international investments with a return on that investment. One of the things I often try to do, because I've had the background and I have not only done the policy, but implemented these international development programs, is really gather this understanding of what foreign assistance looks at. One of the things I think that we have done so well as a party is really promoting, first of all, foreign assistance is not a handout. Two things. One, there has to be accountability and transparency for all federal funding, right? And we do a really good job of that. Second, we have to work with other countries as equal partners. Under the Trump administration at USAID, our signature reform to foreign assistance was called the Journey to Self-Reliance. And our goal in this agency was to look at every investment we made internationally and be able to come back and say at headquarters how that got us one step further to no longer having to provide foreign assistance to a country. It also had to look at what that investment was getting us, again, in the way of stabilizing countries to help our own economy or our own security. So we have to start looking at these things as they can be, which is an investment. And I'll give a quick example of this. If you look across the world, and if I'm partial to this because international investment's my background, especially democracy, rights, and governance, and economic growth and trade. Today, 13 of our top 15 trading partners in the United States are former recipients of US assistance. Why? I'll give South Korea as an example after the Korean War. We went into South Korea. South Korea was bankrupt. It was just a huge humanitarian crisis, right? We were dropping food parcels. We were trying to help feed the people and rebuild the country. In South Korea, we invested there 5 decades. Today, South Korea is our 6th largest trading partner, and we export over $30 billion a year to South Korea. We never even invested $30 billion over the course of those 5 decades in foreign assistance to South Korea. But that is the goodwill, the investments, all of the infrastructure we put in that is now coming back to us, right, at 30-fold. We saw this as well after World War II with the Marshall Plan, right? And looking at the fact that the EU as a bloc, right, is actually our latest trading partner, and the de minimis amount that we actually spent in 2 years helping rebuild up the economy, right? So we have to look at these things as they are, which is an investment. And finally, and this is the point where I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions about, right? And it is true. You know, I hear this all the time. America has to look at its problems first before we try to solve other people's problems. I absolutely understand the thinking behind it, but it's not always a thinking that maybe has all of the details, right? I recently heard this argument. I live in Washington, D.C., and we do have a lot of issues with our public education and education outcomes and attainments. And there was the statement that, well, maybe if we spent less money in Ukraine, right, we would have more books in D.C. public schools. I mean, I don't even know how to start peeling that onion as someone who lives and works in DC, which is, I don't even know how we put those two things together, right? One, it's just a sheer matter of budgeting, and those two things in the public budget don't even meet each other. But the other thing is trying to help people, again, understand why what happens globally affects us here. The border is one of the biggest issues we see, right? That comes up all the time. Michelle, do not talk to me about foreign investment, you know, supporting Ukraine, et cetera, until we talk about the border. And then we have to get into the argument, I understand. Border security is a huge issue. It's something we have to address. But border security on its own is not going to be just addressed through DHS, which is, and I'm very much paraphrasing here for sake of time, the law enforcement agency, right? What we talk about here is we have to talk about the fastest way to prevent migration to the border, right, is to stop the flow of it, right? That's where foreign policy comes in. That's where international development comes in, right? We look at it as the before the border. So in all these things, I go back to my original point, which is we can't make these all such binary decision points, right? It's one or the other, because they're not. In our interconnected world, none of these things are on its own. It's like there was a great example earlier, I think it was Mr. Mitchell, who said something about if you have a brain tumor, right? You might take an aspirin to alleviate your current symptoms. It's not going to alleviate the problem. We have to really look at our domestic problems and sit back and say, we need a fulsome strategy for addressing them. What are the various factors that we need to do to address that? And I'm going to tell you, I've never seen a situation yet where it did not have some focus on a motivator or driver that was not international that also had to be addressed as part of it. So I'm going to stop there. I would love to have a fulsome conversation with you about this, any area of the world you'd like to talk about. But in closing, I would just say this. It is a pleasure to be here, and I'm a proud conservative. I think our party should be so proud of its peace through strength doctrine, of the good we have done over the years. I have worked in some of the worst situations in the world where I have literally come home and said to my husband, I don't think I understood what hell was until I went here. And to know every day as an American that we have so much freedom and we have so much opportunity. I think at the end of the day, I always think of the great value and you know, really even our Judeo-Christian beliefs that say to whom much has been given, much is to be expected. And that is something that has often driven me, and I'm really proud of our country in doing its part to not only help those in need, but to always make sure that we are continuing to make our country stronger and safer and more prosperous for our own citizens. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Michelle. That was just remarkable. I really enjoyed the rendition, kind of tying together all of the threads about what conservative thought is in foreign affairs and how it impacts, you know, our understanding of strength, of peace through strength. I guess I would just return, you know, briefly, you know, for a moment to the issue that you touched on at the end about how, you know, the border is such an important issue in many voters' minds. I know that last month in a Gallup poll, 19% of potential voters said it was the #1 specific issue for them in the upcoming election. And so I wonder, do you think that sometimes we frame that issue not just in terms of a kind of false dichotomy, but also misapprehending that there are these big international dimensions? Things like fentanyl and the fentanyl crisis, which is connected to the border, comes to mind. How would you?
No, and I agree, and it's not, again, I mean, I understand those polls, and I understand the public attitudes right behind that, but it is such a tricky issue, which is a real layman's way to, you know, put it, for two reasons. The first being, you know, let's start with migration, right? You know, today, one of the things I find so interesting, I just got back from a delegation I went on of policymakers to, it was a bipartisan group of former and current policymakers to Mexico, and we were talking about this, right? Because one of the things that I'm always talking about is how do we better use development and diplomacy tools to affect some of what we consider purely a domestic issue, okay, so border security. And our conversations were largely around how do we better work with Mexico, who at this point is actually really the last sort of stop for a lot of the migrants coming from Central America to the southern border. And having these conversations that also have to respect two things. One, Mexico is actually one of our largest trading partners. We don't often think of that because we think China, China, China. It's actually still Mexico and Canada. So we continue to have to do a lot of work with Mexico. They are a big trading partner, but we also have to see them as in partners in helping with the border issues and migrations. And so we were studying some of the policies they had, such as in the Trump administration, where we had, it was paraphrased as Remain in Mexico, right? Where we worked with the Mexican government to actually house, and it was not for unaccompanied minors, a lot of thought went into this, but to house asylum seekers so that we could get a better sense for, you know, were they humanitarian refugees, were they traffickers, what was bringing them to the border, and did they have a truly humanitarian reason to ask for asylum? 70,000, right? We worked with the Mexicans at that time and had 70,000 going through that program from Mexico. And so I often bring that up because it's not just an issue when it gets to the border. And so I try to remind people this is an issue that's going to take us working much more closely with the entire Western Hemisphere, right? And saying, what are these drivers? How do we sort of stem this before it becomes what is primarily, unfortunately, day of at border, a justice issue, right? It becomes now law enforcement, it becomes border security, and it becomes justice. And I think what our government has to better do too is marry those two things, right? Marrying that foreign policy work, the development work, with DHS's work and say, how are we better working hand in hand as a sort of holistic solution? We're gonna touch on fentanyl. One of the things that really concerns me too is I think, although we're starting to see that now, we've always kind of looked at the border issue as simply, economic migrants, right? People are coming in, they're taking our jobs. Increasingly, what are we seeing, right? It's a great opportunity for drug traffickers, for human traffickers. We have even started looking at the statistics of the nationalities of those coming through the border to claim asylum, right? Increasingly from countries we have on terrorist watch lists, Iran, et cetera. And so understanding that this is a much larger issue that really becomes now one of national security as well as counter-narcotics. And fentanyl being an area we could talk about much more, especially with China, is increasingly, I think, drawing attention to just how difficult the border issue has become.
Fascinating, and I completely agree with you on those points. We have so many good questions. I'm going to try to combine a few, and many people in the room seem to be really interested. We've just come out of the DNC.
Yep.
What are the points of comparison and contrast between the two parties' positions? And I ask this specifically because, President Biden, you can disagree with his policies, but he'd been around for decades and had been commenting on foreign affairs. Vice President Harris has a much shorter tenure on the national stage, but also on national kind of foreign policy issues. So what would you point us to in terms of understanding those comparisons and contrasts?
It's such a great question. And I would say some of it, if I may, is posturing. The biggest difference I noticed between the 2 weeks is sort of the posturing of the leaders and how they address the issues. You can agree with them or not agree with their policies, right? They're often talking about the same issues, right? They're talking about the border, they're talking about immigration, right? They're talking about national security. They're even talking about the Israel conflict, the war. But there are policy differences, but the one thing I notice time and again is the posture, right? What you see more in President Trump and his vice presidential pick is what I would go back to again is this sort of bold statements of deterrence. Like, there will be red lines, we will have red lines, you don't want to cross them. And a lot of people, and it was interesting in Milwaukee, a lot of the conversation was around the fact that in the 4 years of the Trump administration, there were no new wars, right? The United States was not embroiled in any new wars. We did not see Russia invading Ukraine. We did not see the attack on Israel. And a lot of the conversation was around the difference in what people saw in deterrence, right? And leadership. Now we'll say, President Biden, our current president, I think there has been a lot of communication in foreign policy, I will say, in DC about the fact that there was a lot of feelings that oftentimes the strategies were not as clear-cut. They were not as decisive, right? The withdrawal of Afghanistan is pointed to so often in so much of the TikTok of what we have seen happen around the world, right? Which was this muddled, okay, we're gonna withdraw, seemingly, and of course I was not a policymaker at that time, but seemingly to the American public, there was not really a plan. It was 3 weeks of utter chaos, not only for the Afghanistan people, but for our own military, those of whom lost their lives in the withdrawal, and not really understanding a strategy. And so I think the two differences I will say is one, this idea of bold diplomacy and deterrence, where it's made very clear that we don't have to be friends with everyone, sort of on this Republican posture, but they need to know that we will work with them if it can be in our best interest. And then I think on the Democratic side, again, talking about the same issues, one of the things I would say is just trying to understand I think Vice President Harris has a big task in front of her, because in some ways, if you read the articles, because I'm like I did this morning too, it was, but what is the strategy for border security, because you've had 4 years to do it, right? So I think some of it is, again, what is the strategy, right? Better communicating and understanding from maybe the Democratic ticket, what concrete steps are they going to take, right? And one thing about conventions, oftentimes, right, you've all been to as many as I have, right? It's about the big buzzwords, right? And it's, again, kind of the values of this party, the values of that party. You're not gonna go into the deep, dive of what the policy actions are going to be. But I think what's really important to do, and those of you in the room who haven't, and maybe this is just because I'm geeky and this is what I do, look at the two platforms next to each other, right? The Republican platform this year was extremely streamlined, 16 pages. When I talked to the RNC about that, what was the reasoning before that? The previous one had been 66 pages, and they said, because if the American citizen can't open this document and clearly understand what we're going to do on immigration, on supporting Israel, to the economy, then it's worth nothing. We need to be streamlined, we need to be concise, and we need to show them what actions we're going to take.
Fascinating, I agree. I think that's very important.
For the platform, it's a great platform. I do encourage you to read it.
Yeah. Easy to download, take a look at that.
Very.
One thing I would just mention to the audience is that the day after Vice President Harris was sort of assumed to be the new candidate, I went and I took a look at a book called Losing the Long Game, which is written by her kind of chief foreign policy advisor, Philip Gordon. Mm-hmm. And this book is remarkable in some ways because it's an extended critique of regime change, and he's looking at specific examples from the Middle East. And the thing that came to my mind is, okay, so we know that this is probably not the best idea in many circumstances, but what about engagement with clients who are really nasty, who do bad things? That doesn't necessarily turn out well. Client states can be big hobgoblins of foreign policy as well. And so in that vein, I thought I'd kind of turn to the question that many people seem to want to address in the room, which is about Iran. And whether, in this sort of repertoire of different policies, diplomacy and development, what role can that play in confronting, one of the great puppeteers of the Middle East that's through proxies creating such havoc?
Is a great question. And I think with Iran, especially when it gets to diplomacy, and you just mentioned sort of the dichotomy, right? The previous speaker had a great line I am going to use, I'm so sorry to her, which is, in God we trust, all else, we will verify or require proof. I just butchered that, but I just thought that was great, right? That's the same as it is with our diplomacy, right? So when you look at the, let's say, Republican posture towards Iran and the GCPOA, right, the agreement, the arms control agreement, and you look at sort of how that posture was different under the current Democratic administration, right? There's two big differences. The first is that through sort of the Republican, I would say conservative model, right, there's very much this idea, when I say deterrence and bold diplomacy, it means we will try. Look at North Korea, right? We will come to the table with you, but let me tell you, we expect you to hold up your side of the bargain, and if you don't, there will be consequences, right? Too many people, when we have seen sort of the backing off of the JCPOA agreement with Iran, was what did Iran do? Well, Iran, the chief state sponsor of terrorism around the world, isn't going to say, thank you. I appreciate your goodwill. We are going to be good team players. We have your best interests at heart, right? What did they do? You give them an inch, they took a mile. I think you just have to look at the TikTok to what has happened since October 7, 2023 in the Middle East to see that Iran very quickly realized there were not going to be diplomatic or other repercussions on them because that deterrence was gone. There was no yin and yang. For example, JCPOA, right? Okay, we're gonna come, we're gonna lift sanctions, right? We're gonna give you more room to breathe. Hamas is sponsored by Iran. After Hamas's deadly attack on Israel, what did we see? Hezbollah attacking US assets in Iraq, in Syria, in Jordan, Hezbollah attacking Israel from Lebanon, And now we have seen Iran itself in April directly attacking the Israel state from its own borders, right? Why? There's no deterrence, right? There's no consequence. It is as simple as when you have a child and you give them an order and they defy it, if you don't have an immediate repercussion to that, right, they're going to keep doing it. And I think that's been the biggest difference with Iran. Iran, China, Russia, and North Korea have created a very strong coalition. We refer to them in the United States as the Quartet of Evil. And what should scare everyone in this room is it has fostered itself in the last 4 years because they have seen, again, many point to Afghanistan, the indecisiveness there, the chaotic withdrawal, lessening up from the JCPOA, all of these things, right? Not really having red lines or not really wondering what the United States will do about it and just thinking they won't do anything about it, right? Not only is this a national security threat of unmitigated proportions, look at where Russia gets most of its equipment from right now in its war against Ukraine, right? It's from these other actors, right? Where is the money coming from, right? China right now is the world's largest bilateral creditor. And let me tell you, that money is not going to a lot of our friends, right? It's also debt diplomacy, but my point is this is not only a national security issue, the 4 countries working together are becoming an economic security issue for us as well.
Great. No, I think that's a very thorough answer, and I have to turn now to a bit of a tougher question.
Oh boy. Worse than Iran.
Well, it seems like people really take you on your word that you deeply care about kind of the actual data, and so one person was sort of asking for an example of a country that you think was directly lifted out of poverty through the use of kind of development policy. I think this person's a bit skeptical of the South Korean example because their greatest growth came after the aid that was given. But I asked this question with some empathy because the Marshall Plan also sort of coincided with European integration. We got things like the European Coal and Steel Commission, which obviously would boost economic growth because it's a liberalization of trade. So how do you see that kind of question? What do you think is the strongest example?
And forgive me if I wasn't clear on that earlier point with South Korea. That was not immediate. And my broader point being was these things, again, to me, are investments, right? If anyone knows of an investment that is overnight, going to guarantee me $30 billion in export in 1 year, please tell me, right? This was a long-term investment, right? This is also like, even though our investments with the Marshall Plans were between 1948 and 1951, right? We've seen this trade really, blow up and profit us in the last, 20 years, right? So these are longer-term investments. I would say, there are a couple really good examples of that. I would say we have had some successes in areas in Eastern Europe, particularly one area you and I have talked about, because I know you have a lot of experience in Kosovo, right? Is looking at a lot of the former communist states, right? So when I started out my career, I started out in what was considered Eurasia at that time. And so it was the newly independent states that were part of the USSR. So this extended all the way from the Baltics, right, past the Balkans through Central Asia. There has been profound success in American engagement in investments, primarily when you look from like the Baltics, when you look at Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, who now are members of the EU and NATO, and let me tell you, providing more than their 2%, right? They're some of the largest donors we have right now to NATO, right? A lot of these Eastern European countries, and a lot of that is because of the great relationships they have with the United States, but because they also understand the threat, right, of autocracy on their borders. So I say our work in Eastern Europe. I use Ukraine as one of these examples within that, right? So you can look at the Baltics, right? Now, the other thing I would remind people is, you mentioned nation state building earlier, right? This is not an overnight process. I don't think any party has ever said we've got this right? Our value is we believe in people's individual rights. As Winston Churchill says, basically paraphrasing, democracy is the best form of government that hasn't failed yet, right? I mean, this is where, we're really behind because we've seen it so far as the best, right? We also know democratic countries statistically are more prosperous, they have better economies, and they're more stable than countries that rate lower on indices of autocracy. And so I would say if you look at that work in Eastern Europe, I would also bring up the Balkans, right? So American engagement in the late 1990s, right? So when you look at, again, this collapse of the former Soviet Union, America spent a lot of time and attention, Western Hemisphere, as well as in the corridor of Eastern Europe, Central Asia, right? Trying to help build up these democracies. One of the things I have to remind people is these things take time, right? So you have a country, and I used to, when I was working in these former countries, they would talk about, you walked into your factory one day, and it's not like this was just a regime change, right? You're a Lithuanian, and you wake up one morning, and I'm making this I'm really making this oversimplified, right? But not only was your government changed, your entire society and culture was changed, right? You went from communism, your political, economic, and social orders all changed. They would walk into their jobs the next day and no one knew who was in charge. So you had these large factories, and because the government state-owned everything, or the government was in charge of the bread lines, people literally the next day were milling around saying, well, do we go to work? Who's in charge of the factory, right? It changed everything, right? And the Americans should be really proud of the work that they have done over the decades to really help build up not only the economy, the free market capitalist economy in these countries, but also the democracy, rights, and governance. They're not perfect, but we have seen a great deal of success in a lot of these former countries of the Soviet Union who were recipients of US aid, some still are, and who are now great partners with us in EU, in NATO, in a lot of our work around the world. And so I think I would point to that. And I mentioned the Balkans only because we also look right now at what has happened there in the late 90s, right? Yugoslavia, also a former communist country. When that broke up, right, you had these various countries that came out of it, and we started to see all this ethnic divides between Kosovo, Serbia, and Albania, right? Which in the 1998 culminated really in a war and a genocide against ethnic Albanians in Kosovo. To this day, Kosovo remains, they have the highest attitude towards the United States of any country in the world. Why? Because they saw us coming in to, and I quote, save them from annihilation, but we also stuck with them, right? There's a lot of question about never-ending wars and how long do we invest in a society, but I think in some of these countries, right, what's really hard is saying, do we have an appetite for the long game? That's a hard question. I myself don't think the long game is necessary in every country. I think what you need is a plan. In every country, again, going back to my term in the Trump administration, right, you need this plan that says, what's the end goal here, right? What are we building up, right? When do we say, you have also committed money, you have contributed, your own funding, your own capacity, your own willingness to be partners in this, and how are we both working towards this together? But there has to be a strategy. There has to be deliverables. We need to start thinking these things as a business case.
Completely agree, and I think, one sort of arena of the globe where you saw President Trump's foreign policy really come into fruition as the administration progressed was in the Asia-Pacific region, where his vision was to refocus American foreign policy on that part of the world, and I think he did things like reinvigorate the Quad, which kind of shows us that it was not America first and alone, it was America first, not alone. And so I wonder whether you could tell the audience, because there are so many really pointed, fascinating questions about the Asia-Pacific region, about where you see kind of vital American interests being won through kind of the broad set of foreign policy approaches that you mentioned.
No, it's a great question. I think so often, right, in our foreign policy discussions, right, it's dominated just by China, right? China, China, China. And I think one of the things, and really where I see a lot of the gains, was in using that understanding of China as sort of competitor number one to actually sort of reorient our view outside of China into the Asia Pacific. And starting to ask ourselves questions like, okay, well, if China is sort of, competitor number one, where should we be looking to sort of create other support, right? And we sort of re-engaged, and in some areas, engaged in the Asian Pacific in ways we hadn't before, right? So why are we doing this? Again, there's an economic cost to this, right? Okay, Taiwan, I use Taiwan a lot as an example. 90% of all semiconductors in the world, where are they at? Taiwan, right? We need those for almost every manufacturing, cars, computers, whatever we're doing, right? We need that. The Taiwan Strait, 44% of all global shipping routes go through that, right? We started looking at what if China would invade Taiwan? What if China would try to take control of that strait, right? This will have huge repercussions on our economy and obviously the global economy. And so we started really reinforcing and building, the Quad is a great example, AUKUS, which stands for Australia, the US, and the UK. That new cooperation that has come together has really done a lot, because what it said is, again, America needs strong allies. Even China, for all its faults, right, has found 3 other friends, right? Iran, North Korea, Russia, and China. I would love to be in a conversation with those 4. I don't think any of them particularly cares for the other, but they are bound together, right? America looks at it as well as like, who are our alliances, right? And we recognize, again, one, we can't turn away from those areas because especially with China, right, we need to make sure we have regional support. The other thing we've started looking at is what I alluded to earlier, which is Chinese investments, right? So 20 years ago, like 2001, the Chinese economy was 12% of what US GDP was. Today it's 78%, right? They have steadily and quickly made gains, right? They are our chief economic competitor across the world, and they'd love to see the yuan replace the US dollar as the chief currency, right? So these are things we think of, and we start looking at, well, how is this happening? And I think it's been a good thing because it's refocused our efforts. Right now, China leads the United States in having the most diplomatic missions in countries around the world, and is the top trading partners to 120 countries around the world. I mean, they're blowing us out of the water, right? And again, when I'm saying, like, we're looking at all these issues, America's global engagement through the economic and national security lens, this needs to really concern us. And so we started looking at, where are they investing? Sub-Saharan Africa. By 2050, in 25 years, Sub-Saharan Africa's population is going to double, right? Right now, we spend a lot of time, as we should, looking at the Asia Pacific, but I continue to encourage people to start really fostering and looking at our efforts in Sub-Saharan Africa. This is an area that has heavily been invested in by China through debt trap diplomacy, right? These are, not, let's just say this is money being given for infrastructure programs that are shoddy, that often result in default. And so again, China owning key industries or infrastructures like ports or railroads in your countries, right? These are problems for us because through their Belt and Road Initiative, they've increased their spending 430%. They are looking for global dominance by creating these relationships, often through a creditor relationship all across the world. So for the United States, one of the things that makes it so difficult is there's not one region of the world for us to look at, right? All of these things are so interwoven. And I think that's really, for someone like myself in my line of work, that's the challenge. When you have this many areas around the world where you feel like you have to be paying attention to, right? What is the approach that's going to be winning? And I think that's where we have to continue to look back and say, what is our strategy? Our most influential strategy and productive strategy is that alliance building, right? We cannot do this alone, and we're not going to do it alone, right? I also haven't even talked about the role of the US private sector in any of this, which is, it's a huge factor and really why we will continue to always outpace China because of the innovation and the preeminence of the US private sector. But America can't do it on its own. America shouldn't do it on its own. It's also why, or especially in the Trump administration I'll talk about, there was such a conversation and a dialogue around other countries having to also pay their fair share. Why? We can't handle all the world's problems. There would never be enough money in our strapped budget, which is strapped already, to do it, and we shouldn't have to, right? We're not the policemen, but we do want to be engaged as America's global leader, right? We want to continue to see freedom and democracy flourish. We want our economy to continue to flourish with trade, and we don't want to send our men and women into harm's way. The way we have to do that then is building these regional alliances and encouraging other states through NATO, through other international organizations, right? We're not going to come out of them, but what we're going to say is you got to pay your own share. If this is a defensive, cooperative pact, it means we're all in it together, right? And I think America has been right at encouraging its partners in doing their fair share, right? We shouldn't have to do it all alone.
Well, Michelle, I'm afraid that has to be our last question, much as I'd like to continue with you. I don't think I'm alone in saying that this is one of my favorite panels so far in the conference. But thank you all for your attention, and if you'll join me in just giving her a round of applause.
Well, thank you, George.